Okay, great. So yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. We hope you're all doing okay, and that you're coping okay in lockdown. Obviously, we're missing having everybody around, but hopefully we'll all be back in person at some point soon. So what we've got today is a talk about a research project that I'm involved in, and it's about essentially asking a question of whether people want the world to be fairer or whether they want the world to be safer. So we're looking specifically at what members of the public think about that. Now, this is joint work co-authored with the people you can see in the pictures on the bottom of the screen. So there's Danai Arroyo-Calvera. Now, she's a research fellow working with me, but she's actually going to be a lecturer in the department from next year. And then there's Judith Covey, who is a professor of psychology up in Durham, and Graham Looms, who is at Warwick University. And anybody that's heard about something called regret theory, then Graham's the one that came up with that. If you haven't heard yet, I'm sure you will if you take any behavioural or experimental economics courses going forward. So first of all, I'd like to ask you to imagine a city. And let's say the city looks just like this. And this city is made up of two zones. One zone is the east zone and one zone is the west zone. And people live either in one zone or the other in the city. And now let's imagine the city is supplied with its water by two reservoirs. That's what they look like. So there's one reservoir that supplies the east zone and one that supplies the west zone. But these reservoirs are contaminated with bacteria. So those are my clip art bacteria that you can see there. And we've got two different types of bacteria, one that affects more people in the east zone and one that affects more people in the west zone of the city. Now, if you were making policies about safety and you had to decide which of those bacteria you should target, how would you make that decision? So there's lots of things you might want to know before you can make that decision. That could be things like which bacteria is harming the most people. Maybe you'd prefer to target the bacteria that harms the most people. And maybe one of the bacteria actually affects everybody in the city, whereas another bacteria only affects people in one part of the city, and that might change your decision as well. Maybe you would like to target the bacteria which makes people most at risk. So maybe people that already have a higher chance of dying, you would want to help those people more than the other people. Or maybe you'd think, well, actually, which bacteria affects me, right? Which one affects where I live? And then you might think, I'll make my decision on that basis. So there's lots of reasons why you might think that the government policy making about how to allocate their resources to make people safer might depend on different aspects of the decision. So it might depend on different things about the situation. So when you're making that decision, you may or may not consider which policy or which strategy will save the most lives overall. Okay. However, most of what policy making does at the moment is it just targets that one thing. So it would target saving the most people. And what this project is all about is trying to understand whether there are other things that matter to people that should be taken into account. So is it okay just to try and make people as safe as possible? Or do we also need to take into account some of these other concerns about helping people that are more at risk, trying to help a broader proportion of people, even if you save fewer lives overall? And how that's going to matter when you include the idea of people's self-interested behaviour. So this is quite a stylized setting, and actually it's the setting we all use in the experiment that I'm going to explain to you. But actually it's not just about this abstract setting with bacteria in a city. When we think about how we should allocate resources in a healthcare setting, there's lots of real world examples where we have to trade off different types of illnesses, different types of response. So for example, I've pulled a few examples from the news. So we've got to think about, at the moment, policymakers and people in the NHS are having to really consider where to target their scarce resources. So for example, there's a lot of discussion about, or was especially previously, about if there's not enough ventilators to go around, or looking forward, maybe if there's not enough vaccine to go around, who should we help and how should we target it? We're already seeing treatment centres, so this is my local Coventry and Warwickshire hospital, have released a press release that says actually minor injuries and illnesses can't be treated here anymore because we need to free up space for COVID-19 responses. And that's implying a trade-off between different types of illness, different types of safety that are more important or less important at the moment. There's an opinion piece that came up in the FT just recently, which talks about how we're prioritising old people at the moment. We're trying to save the old. And at some point, that's going to have to be made up to the young people who are facing the costs, essentially, of these policies. So I think all of you are staying home, presumably, and taking care not to go out and about and meet your friends, even though your own personal risk may not be very high when it comes to COVID. But you're doing that because you are trying to protect and help the broader society, including those people that are more at risk than you are. And it's not just about prioritization within health settings. So it's not just about individuals trading off their own convenience against other people's safety, for example. In fact, we've got broader trade-offs at play. So there are lots of expert takes at the moment on whether the economic harms of shutdown are worth it in terms of the benefits, in terms of lives saved. And as economists, it's our job to think about how we should trade off these things. We have to understand when we have scarce resources and competing wants and competing needs, how can we trade those things off and come to the right decision for society as a whole about how we spend our resources. So again, as economists, we don't just think about health, of course. I hope many of you do think about health because it's a very important application of what we do. But it's not, when we think about trading off scarce resources, of course, this goes way beyond that. So as a society, we have to think about how we would trade off education against health. For example, we've closed down much of what's happening in the university and schools, and that's because we're making a trade-off between the education of young people against the health of our society. We can also think of trade-offs between the environment against the economy, for example. So any of you that have taken modules in environmental economics will have been thinking about what's the value of an improvement in the environment and what cost is it worth incurring to protect the environment. And you'll also have been learning, of course, about lots of interactions there, where if we protect the environment, that's actually going to be good for the economy, similarly in terms of health and in terms of education. So it's not always a direct trade-off of either we spend on health or we get economic benefit elsewhere. Often it's going to go in the same direction. But we're interested in cases where those things are competing. So how do we make difficult trade-offs between different uses of societal resources? And just to bring some examples from the news on this one as well, just to get you thinking about the right way to allocate and spend resources, I've got a few possibly slightly contentious examples for you to chew over. So I took a headline here that talks about Oxford University offering 2 state school pupils a place for every privately educated student. Now, the proportion of state school to privately educated students that exist is obviously very different than 2 to 1. So there's a question there about, are we trying to bring into the top universities those students that will perhaps benefit the most from there? Are we going to look just at grades on the intake, or are we going to try and make things a little bit more equitable or more fair and change these ratios? And you'll find people arguing very strongly on both sides of that debate. We also have examples just looking at wealth. So there's a statistic that came out, I think, from Oxfam that said that 26 billionaires, just 26 people that are billionaires, hold more wealth than half of the rest of the planet. Okay, and there are again issues and contentions around that statistic, but the point is that there's a lot of wealth held in a very small proportion of the population. And you might say, well, actually, if wealth is concentrated where it's the most productive, so those billionaires perhaps can be more productive with the money that they have compared to if it was spread out across society, then you might argue that that is a reasonable thing. But you might say, well, actually, that's not very equitable, that's not very fair. And if you think that that means that we should redistribute some of that wealth across the planet even, then you're making an assessment based on a trade-off between efficiency and equity. And finally, this example of there's more people called David and Steve that lead FTSE 100 companies than there are women and ethnic minorities. And again, you could argue about who's the best candidate for the job, but you could also argue about making things more fair and redressing balances. So the point I'm making here is that when we think about trade-offs between efficiency and equity, we're not just thinking about abstract settings or even about things that economists typically consider, but actually this is really, really broadly applicable. So to summarize kind of the bigger picture around this project, we're really asking a question that is fundamental to all of economics, which is when resources are scarce, how should we distribute them? And in microeconomics, for those of you that had the pleasure of second year micro already, we talk a lot about this, and we talk about how to best allocate scarce resources. And our answer in micro in second year has typically been, let's let the market take care of it, because the market is a beautiful mechanism to efficiently allocate resources. And depending on a lot of strong assumptions, we can show, and we did show, and for those of you that have yet to experience their second year, we will show together, that if we let the market take care of it, and under some strict assumptions, we'll get a Pareto efficient equilibrium. And that was demonstrated using the tool of the Edgeworth box, and there's an example on the screen that I won't talk about because this isn't a micro lecture particularly, but just to draw some comparisons with what you've done with me or what you're going to do in the future with us. But we also touched upon welfare economics, and we asked, okay, so we can get to an efficient allocation by letting the market do its thing, but which efficient allocation do we want to be in? And we talked about how you might choose between different allocations. So two key definitions that we need here are efficiency and equity. So efficiency in general we can think of as maximizing output from a given endowment of resources. Now there are lots of different subtle variations in efficiency definitions, and different types of efficiency have different definitions, but overall the broad idea is that we're going to maximize what we can get given where we begin. So in our example, when we think back to the beginning of the talk of our city, if we wanted to maximize efficiency, we'd just be trying to give the largest possible gain in safety by tackling the bacteria in the way that makes people safer overall. But the second definition I'd like you to think about is equity. And again, we've got loads of definitions of equity, and if you Google it, you'll find many, many versions of it. But the overarching idea there is that resources should be allocated somehow fairly. And in our city example, what we're going to use as the definition of a perfectly equitable allocation would be one that gives an equal gain in safety to everybody in that city. Yeah? So we're thinking about efficiency as getting the most that we can overall out of the resources that we have. And then we've got equity, which thinks about how those resources are allocated and how fair that is. So how do governments actually currently allocate resources that are aimed at making us safer? Well, actually, when you think about safety, you often think about what's called the value of a prevented fatality. And I've talked about this as well to a lot of you before. So how this works is you're trying to measure the rate at which people would trade off wealth against risk. And if you do that, you can get out a marginal rate of substitution between wealth and fatality risk. And then if you ask enough people what their trade-off would be between wealth and fatality risk, you can work out societal willingness to pay to reduce the risk of dying. And that's how the government does it. So they commission a study, and they would ask people what they would trade off in terms of money for small changes in risk. So they might say, how much would you pay for a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction in your risk of dying? And people might say, well, £200 for that. That would be worth that for me. And if people said that, then all I would have to do is multiply that £200 by the 10,000 people that I'd asked, and then I'd get a value of £2 billion. And that is actually the value that they use at the moment in government policy making as the value of preventing a fatality. But that value is based on people's self-interested decisions about how much they would pay to reduce their own risk of dying. It doesn't take any account of who is being made safer. It also doesn't take any account of whether people would like other people to be made safer as well as themselves. So it's a completely self-interested method. But what the government does is it takes that value and it would apply it in a cost-benefit analysis, and it would choose a policy that gains the most in terms of lives saved, because that's how the value measure is working. So what that means is that government policy making at the moment uses a self-interested value and then seeks to maximize efficiency. It completely ignores equity. And what this project is about is questioning whether that's appropriate in terms of what people think. So we touched upon in micro, or for those of you that haven't done it, you will experience this in future. We touched upon the idea of a social welfare function, and this can help us because it can introduce the idea of distribution into our policy making decisions. So here's the social welfare function, and all it's saying is that overall in society, welfare is a function of the underlying welfare of the people in that society. So utility of person 1, person 2, up to person n in our society. And depending on how we put parameters in our social welfare function, so just what that function looks like, we can make it take account of different things. So we could say that welfare of different groups in society can have different weights. So at the moment, for example, if we knew that the person or the group in this first category was an NHS worker, we might say, well, actually, we're going to prioritise their welfare at the moment because we want them to be productive and capable. So we might direct resources and tests to them. It could instead be that we parameterize the function just to make sure that if welfare is evenly distributed across society, then overall welfare is higher. Or we could say we're going to focus on those people at the bottom of the welfare distribution and make our function value them more highly. Or we could say, a more simple case, overall welfare is higher if the sum of welfare is maximized. And that's more like an efficiency-focused setup. So the question is, how do we decide what are the appropriate parameters for this function? How can we do it? And there are two competing schools of thought about that in research. One is that we should start with axioms. Okay, so we might say, from initial principles of what the world should look like, we're going to build up to a social welfare function. But the second way, and the way that we're concerned with here, is that we should perhaps just ask members of the public what they think. So remember, we're trying to respect the preferences of the public here. That's the whole goal of what government policy making is about. They want to try and maximize the welfare of society as society sees it. So if that's the case, then we should be asking members of the public what they think about these things before we go ahead and make policy. So our research is aiming at answering the question on the screen. How do members of the public trade off efficiency, equity, and their own self-interest in the context of fatality risks? So I'll skip quickly through a literature review. Those of you that have started to think about their dissertations or maybe have completed theirs will be well versed in the idea of reviewing the literature in order to set up their research question. So I'm not going to go through the detail, but just to show you that we've considered a lot of the literature out there that looks at equity, self-interest, and safety trade-offs as well. But what none of this has done before is brought together the idea of people trading off efficiency versus equity in cases where they are involved in this scenario. So there is some self-interest as well. So what did we do? Well, to answer this question, we went out and asked members of the public. And we did this through an online survey, which involved a number of stages. So first of all, we just introduced the scenario, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then we asked people to rate different policy options. Then they made some choices between them. And they told us how they felt about general principles underlying how we could organise this society. And then we elicited some information about them and allowed them to send us any comments they wanted. And we varied whether people were told they lived in the city or whether they were impartial observers. So we often talk in economics about the idea of a benevolent social planner that's deciding how to allocate resources in that society. And here we wanted to know whether people prefer different allocations when they are the benevolent social planner perspective versus whether they are told they live in the city. So remember this is our city that I described at the beginning with two zones, the east zone and the west zone. And remember we said that each side of the city is being harmed by some bacteria. So let's put some specific context there. we say that 100,000 people live in the East Zone, and 18 of them are expected to die from the bacteria if nothing is done about them. And for some participants, we tell them they live in the East Zone. So there's a risk of 18 in 100,000 of dying in the East Zone. In the West Zone, we also have 100,000 people, and we told everybody that these people were not different in any way, just happened to live in a different side of the city. But here, 28 people are expected to die from this bacteria, so the risk is higher at 28 in 100,000. But nobody was told they live here. Okay. And then we offered some policy options, and these would reduce the risk of dying in different parts of the city. So remember, we have the East Zone and the West Zone, and the baseline risk, so that's the starting risk that we have, is 18 in the East Zone and 28 in the West Zone. And we offered 4 different policies. The first one would reduce the risk by 10 lives in the East Zone, but none in the West Zone. So it would help you if you live in the East Zone, but it doesn't help anybody in the West. Policy W for West helps 20 people in the West Zone, but nobody in the East Zone. So this is a more efficient policy, okay? It's saving more lives overall. It's also not equitable, because just like policy E, it only helps people in one half of the city. However, it does help those people who are most at risk, and it's more efficient. Then we have policy B, which reduces risk in both zones, but it does it by 8 in each zone. So clearly the overall risk reduction is 16 here. So that's less efficient than policy W, but it's more equitable because it's helping people in both areas. And finally, we have policy X, which reduces risks by 4 in the West Zone and 3 in the East Zone. So again, it's quite equitable. People are being helped in both zones. It's very inefficient compared to the other policy options, but it's also helping those people more at risk because it helps the West more than the East. So hopefully you can see that these policies are designed so that they make people trade off different combinations of these potential reasons that they might care about saving people. So we can trade off efficiency versus self-interest when we compare policy W versus policy E. Or we could compare equity against efficiency when we compare B with policy W, for example. We also directly elicit what they think about these things. So not only do we ask them to make these numerical trade-offs and choose policies, but also we ask them to tell us directly how they would make those decisions. So how did it look? Well, people saw the 2 examples of the policies, and then they made a choice. They told us how strongly they'd prefer one option over the other. In the principle statements, where they described directly what their moral principles were, we asked them to trade off different competing principles. So for example, in this case, we're asking people to say that whether they agree with the first statement, which says the chosen option should make the water a lot safer for the people most at risk, rather than a little safer for everyone, against the opposite version of that statement, which says the chosen option should make the water a little safer for everyone, rather than a lot safer for those most at risk. So people had to tell us where they thought they lay on the distribution between strongly favouring the first statement to strongly favouring the second one. So this allows us to see whether people think their preferences are the same as the preferences they express through the choices they make. And just as a spoiler, they really were very, very similar. So they knew what they thought. So who did we ask? Well, 732 people. They took part through something called Prolific, which is an online survey sampling pool. So if you're looking for something to do while you're in lockdown and you're bored, maybe sign up for Prolific, because it allows you to answer surveys and you get a small amount of money. So for example, we paid £2 to each of our participants for answering this survey for us. So it's a general population sample. We selected people in the UK because we wanted to inform UK policy making, and the mean age was 32, with about half of our sample being female. And just to go straight to the results, firstly, did they like the policies? We asked them to rate them between 1 very poor and 5 very good. And what we see is that people really like policy B. That's the one that helps people, 8 people in each zone, so it's equitable. And even though policy W is more efficient, they like it less. Okay? Remember, the further the mass of this distribution is towards the right, the better they think the policy option is. So their most preferred was B, then probably X, which was the very inefficient but equitable option, then W, and then E. So it looks very much like we're not, people are not really focusing on efficiency as much as they are on equity in their ratings of the policies. And this is borne out in the choices, really. So they like policy B, then W, then E, then X. Okay, so that means they like the policy that's equitable and quite efficient. Then they like the policy that's efficient but not equitable, so that saved 20 people, but all in the West Zone. And then they were kind of indifferent between 10 people, which was not equitable, and 7 people, which was more equitable. Okay, so we can look at how they rated the options and also how they chose between the options to get an idea of how they trade off these different principles. And there's just some supporting stats here. These are, for those of you that are curious about the statistics, these are Wilcoxon-Sign rank tests that check for differences between the options on all the different comparisons we can make. Okay. So moving on to the principles, we wanted to see how they weigh up the different principles when we asked directly about them. And we see that people actually most preferred efficiency, but they also very strongly cared about equity, and they cared less about helping those people most at risk. And actually, they cared very little about protecting their own self-interest. Of course, that is something that maybe they were saying because they wanted to impress us as the experimenters. So that's why we wanted to do the choice version as well, where that was a little bit hidden and there was a less serious role for the problem of experimenter demand effects. So, turning to regression analysis, this is where we can quantify the amount that they care about the different options as based on the choices that they make. So our dependent variable, our y variable, is the choice of that policy option. And then the explanatory variables, or our x variables, will be efficiency, equity, how much it benefits yourself, and how much it benefits those people most at risk. And we can just classify each policy numerically on each of these levels because of the way we designed them. We also included a dummy variable for which condition they were in, so that picked up whether they were told they lived in the East Zone or not, right? So that was our difference between being an impartial social planner or somebody that lives in the city. And we included interaction terms, so we interacted the condition dummy, so the self-interest dummy, with the policy options that we've talked about, the efficiency, equity, benefit to self, and benefit to those most at risk. And then we included some typical demographic variables. Just a note again, for those of you statistically minded, we did standard errors clustered at the participant level, and using this alternative specific constant logit, it's a specific type of logit where it accounts for the fact that these options were paired together. So it accounts for the fact that we're not viewing independent observations because people were making pairwise comparisons between options. So it's quite a clever model, and one that you might have come across, especially if you've done anything to do with a choice experiment or a discrete choice experiment, for those of you that have completed dissertations this year. And we present the answers in terms of odds ratios. So anyone that's thought a lot about logit regressions or logistic regressions will know that if you run a logistic regression, the output that you get is in terms of log odds, and that's quite difficult to interpret. So we convert them into odds ratios here so that we can interpret them. Okay, so that's the stats lesson for the day. Let's move on and talk about what these models are. So we're going to look at our fourth model, which is the big model that includes everything, although we built it up from first principles. And here it is. So I hope you can see it on the screen clearly enough. But what we can see is that, to interpret each of these coefficients, we basically compare them to the number 1. So 1 would mean there's no difference in the likelihood of choosing the option based on the x variable that we're studying. So here we can see that if an option saves 1 more life, because efficiency is 1 unit higher, that option is 14.1% more likely to be chosen because the odds ratio is now 1.14. So that's how we read the table. So what we can see is that efficiency is positive and significant, equity, positive and significant, but smaller. Options that benefit people that are most at risk are also positive, but it only makes you 2% more likely to choose an option if it benefits people most at risk by 1. So that's a smaller and less strong effect than we got for the other cases. Benefiting oneself here is quite important. So remember, people told us that they didn't care about self-interest at all. Actually, when we look at the data, it suggests that they do, and they care about it more than helping people most at risk, at least. we found also, quite interestingly, a negative effect when we interacted efficiency with self-interest. So what that means is those people that were told they lived in the area and they lived in the city, they were less likely to choose the most efficient option. And that makes sense, because the most efficient option was typically the one that helped the people in the West Zone, which isn't where they lived. So we're seeing an effect of self-interest there as well. So overall, just to summarize those key findings, people cared a lot about efficiency. They also cared about equity, and they were willing to trade off a little bit of efficiency to gain in equity. They were a little bit more likely to choose an option that helps people most at risk, but a lot more likely to choose an option if it saves another person where they live, so it benefits them. And that kind of summarizes the results that we had. So hopefully you can see how, based on some stylized choices that we got people to make between policy options, we can actually understand some quite fundamental things about how they think society should be organized. So just to discuss those results, think about what they really mean. Firstly, the point that we are trying to make in the paper is that in order to respect societal preferences, we need to understand what they are and how they look. So we actually do that by shedding new light on those public preferences for the distribution of these safety policies across society. So efficiency actually matters most, but it's closely followed by equity, according to the regression. And people are willing to give up efficiency if it means things can be made fairer. I'm not going to repeat these because it's basically repeating what we said before, but what you can do with these insights is you can use them to help define the parameters of a social welfare function that means that government decision-making can best respect people's preferences. So I set up with a lot of motivation based around the pandemic. So we've been thinking a little bit about what our results could tell us about the pandemic and how the government's reaction has been. And what our results are suggesting is that people that are at lower risk are actually what we've observed in the pandemic is that people like you and me, probably at lower risk, have actually been willing to make sacrifices that protect other people, especially those people that are more at risk than they are. And people are not clearly just motivated by self-interest, but they actually want to make actions and do things that improve the chance of society as a whole succeeding and beating the pandemic. They also specifically feel very outraged by things that look like lack of fair treatment. So if you think about in the UK, the case of care homes, that people think that the care homes have been under-resourced and forgotten about in the government's response until recently. And people have been very angry about that. And I think that's because they perceive this as a lack of equity in the way that these resources have been distributed. So a lot of resources have gone towards the health service and less towards care. And if we want to understand all of these reactions to the pandemic, we can actually put them into quite nice context by looking at the results of our study and others like it. So we can actually show that it's not just because we're in a pandemic that people are behaving like this, but actually overall they are willing to make personal sacrifice to boost the efficiency or the equity of society, and that they care equally or almost equally about things being fair as they do about things being the most effective. And government should recognise and respect that preference for fairness as well as the basic preference for efficiency if it wants to truly respect the preferences of the people that it's meant to serve. So that's basically all I have to say. If you're interested, we have a paper that's published about this, and the link is well, the title's there, so you can find it on Google Scholar. There's also a blog post that describes the results and the paper in a bit more of an accessible way. And if you ever want to chat about this stuff, or if you're thinking about your dissertation for next year and it's sparked your interest, then both me and Danai would be delighted to speak to you about it when we're back in the same part of the world. But in any case, I hope you found it interesting, bit of food for thought, and if anybody has any questions about it, I'd be more than happy to hear them. So for now, I'll stop sharing my screen and see if anybody's got anything to ask.
So if anybody does have a question, I think the easiest way is probably to type it in the chat box. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you type it in the chat, and then Rebecca can answer. And if not, we will end the session. So of course, you know, thank you very much for that, Rebecca. I think that was awesome, actually. Really good. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Really interesting session. We will put the recording up on social media, on the closed Facebook groups, etc. You know, if you thought this talk was good, please encourage your friends to watch it. I think a lot of the things that Rebecca said today are actually quite useful for the second year students in completing their bridging coursework. So that's worked out quite well. Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you again at some point when we're all allowed to. Take care.